So my experiences suggest that young Latina girls are likely to struggle with poverty and that she probably doesn't have a job. I don't know that these things are true about her, but they do fit with my previous experiences and what I know about our culture and the opportunities available to Latinas. So they are those assumptions that I have, those things that I believe are likely to be true, are probably going to shape how I interact with her. Remember, the goal of this activity is really to kind of connect into the assumptions that we make and how they might affect our interactions with people. So let me get into my explanation of what we're going to accomplish in this webinar. The goal of this webinar is to help us understand more about what micro-messages are and how they impact interactions and after-school programs, and how we can address the biases, the implicit biases that we all have, and how we can make a difference in our programs by being more aware of our biases and assumptions. So we're going to work on some strategies that can help us address unconscious bias. And these are strategies that you can use for yourself, or you can also use as a resource in training your staff. And there are 4 action steps that we're going to cover in this webinar. First, the first step to really making a difference in your program is to assume that you have biases. And the second is to examine your worldview, to be more aware of those assumptions that you make, and then be intentional about how you interact with others and make change happening by focus on one behavior at a time and trying to change one behavior at a time. So that's what we want to focus on in the webinar today, is how we can take these action steps for ourselves as we interact with staff and youth in after-school programs, and also how we can support our staff in taking these action steps to make a difference for the youth in their program. Our last activity, the images and question of who is this person, helped us reflect on the assumptions that we often make and how these assumptions can reflect unconscious bias. So let's assume that we all have some bias that shapes the way we perceive the world around us and the people that we meet. And we're going to move on to the second of our action steps. The second step is to examine your worldview. And here's an activity that can help you examine your worldview. On that piece of paper that you have in front of you, I want you to start by making a list of 4 groups of people who are different from you. I'm going to leave that very open for you to define people who are different from you. As you make your list of 4 groups of people, think about people from cultural groups, age groups, neighborhoods, races, or ethnicities that are different from your own. Now, as a second step, I want you to take a moment to describe people who are like you. Come up with 4 or 5 words that describe a group of people that you are part of. Now look over your to list. Is there anything that surprises you or makes you uncomfortable about the list that you created? One of the things I noticed about the list that I created personally is that gender and class had a lot to do with my list. And I don't know if that's because those issues have been in the news a lot recently, or why those became top of mind to me in terms of describing people who are like me or people who are different from me. Remember, the goal of this activity is to really try to think about who we are, what the assumptions are that we make, and to have a better sense of what our own worldview is. And it's very personal, it's unique to each of us, but in terms of making a difference in how we interact with the youth in our programs, we really do need to have that time to examine our own worldview initially. The image here is from NAEP, the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity, and the culture wheel that they have illustrated here helps us understand how culture shapes our beliefs and forms our biases about people based on things like age, gender, race, language, ability or disability, class, or income level. All of these things affect how we view the people around us, often without our own realization that they're shaping our interactions and our views. We tend to communicate these biases through small, subtle, unconscious, but often very powerful micro-messages. And the youth in our after-school programs receive hundreds or sometimes thousands of micro-messages every day. Taken together, micro-messages affect how they perceive themselves, their self-efficacy. Micro-messages can impact their vision of themselves and their future and their expectation of success. So if you look at the bottom of the culture wheel here are micro-messages, and then as you go around the wheel, those micro-messages contribute to an accumulation of advantage, of positive messages, or of disadvantage for youth. They impact their self-efficacy, their behavior, their cultural stereotypes, their biases in terms of how people treat them and how they treat others. And the message that NAEP is putting forth here is, as educators, we can interrupt this cycle by being intentional about the type of micro messages that we send. So the positive messages are called micro-affirmations, and they let youth know they're valued, included, encouraged, and tend to be positive and intentional. Negative messages are called micro-inequities, and micro-inequities make people feel excluded, devalued, discouraged, and usually they're unintentional. It's not a message that we tend to send on purpose, but they still are sent, are communicated. And how we use messages in our after-school program is going to make a difference for youth. And it's going to help them use their own culture and their own role in the world as a point of strength to build on for their self-efficacy. So this brings us to our third step in those 4 steps. First, we recognize that we have biases. Second, we examined our worldview through the mirror activity. And now we're going to think about how we can be intentional with how we interact with the youth in our programs. So I'm going to start by doing this by sharing a video with you that is from the teaching channel. And usually I don't have videos from other resources, so this is going to be a little bit challenging today. But this video was so appropriate for our topic today because it is a group of educators who are taking a training program from NAEP that is helping them focus on the micro messages that they are using in their classroom. So I wanted the opportunity to share. The video is going to show these educators talking about the intentional changes that they've made in their STEM teaching. So what I want you to pay attention to as we watch the video is what are the changes the educators decided to make, and do you see an impact in their classroom based on the changes that they've made? And we will give you a chance to discuss those topics in chat boxes when we come back. As you are finishing up watching the video and coming back onto the main screen, I'd like you to make some observations about what intentional changes you saw the educators make, and then what impact that may have had on their classroom. I want to thank those of you who shared your observations in the chat box. Some real positive things that you noticed. Some intentionality around language, trying to be inclusive and using gender-neutral terms, to be careful with the language that you use, to convey messages about failure, about effort and trying. Those are really important. And we saw in the classroom some impacts on that, that they were engaged with testing and they were okay with things not working, that using the brick made it fun to fail, and that was okay. It seemed to be a classroom where girls and boys were both engaged, and that's a goal that we have for our program. So those are all some real positive observations that we had. One of the things I want to point out about the video is there seems to be a lot of focus here on what the teachers are saying, and they're focusing on how they convey those messages through their words. But the real power of micro-messaging is in our nonverbal communication. What's really important in terms, especially of micro-inequities, is those negative messages come across when what we do, our nonverbal communication, doesn't match what we say. And this is especially important when what we say is positive, but our nonverbal communication doesn't support that. In that case, the nonverbal message becomes more important than the words that we've said, because it comes across as insincere, and you perceive that as an inequity. So that's important to think about when we're planning how to send positive micro messages, is to focus not just on the words we use, but the other ways that we're using nonverbal communication. You can see in the image here the openness in her body language and gestures. Those messages are just as important as her verbal use of gender-neutral terms to engage all learners in her classroom. So now I want to talk a little bit about micro-inequities. Micro-inequities are those small, subtle, and often subconscious messages that are negative. Remember with micro-messaging that we send between 40 and 50 micro-messages to another person in the space of a 1-minute conversation. So let me say that again. Researchers estimate that in a 1-minute conversation between two people, each person is sending between 40 and 50 micro-messages to the other. So that's a lot. And as I said before, when the nonverbal messages don't match the verbal messages that we're sending, those nonverbal messages are much more strong than the verbal messages. So that's where micro-inequities tend to come out, when those nonverbal messages make people feel devalued, slighted, discouraged, or excluded, even if the verbal message is positive. So think about a time when you felt excluded. Does that make sense to you in terms of being a micro-inequity, a micro-message that is negative? Here's a couple of examples that might sound familiar from an after-school program, and as I share these, feel free to share your own thoughts or experiences in the chat box. Maybe micro-inequities that you've observed in your program between youth or in your own personal experience. So here's an example that might happen in an after-school program. You just hired a new staff member and are introducing her to your team. You introduce her to the science teacher. He shakes her hand and says hello, but barely makes eye contact and immediately returns to grading papers. Think about what message has your new team member received? What message did you receive? You can share your ideas in the chat box. Here's another example. Most of the staff in your after-school program are in college, and they've planned to get together after work at a local coffee shop. An invitation to an older married staff member is accompanied with an insincere smile and a sideways glance. What message do you think this staff member received? Was it the verbal or nonverbal message that was important? Again, share your ideas in the chat box. And I'm focusing here on micro-messaging with staff, because that's just as important as micro-messaging with students. Because if your staff don't feel valued and appreciated, then they're going to be more likely to share negative micro-messages with the youth in your program as well. So what are your thoughts on micro-inequities? Are these examples that I've just shared consistent with your experience? Does this idea of a micro-inequity make sense to you? Before we go on to talk about micro-affirmations, I want to see if there's any questions or any clarification you need about micro-inequities. So micro-affirmations are positive micro-messages. They can be intentional or unintentional. But micro-affirmations cause people to feel valued, included, and encouraged. Micro-affirmations say, I see you, I value you, I appreciate your difference, or I believe in your potential. And micro-messages are really important in contributing to creating a safe environment in an after-school program. I'd really like to get your input in the chat box about how you have seen micro-affirmations work in an after-school program, or questions that you have about using micro-affirmations to create a safe about this. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, so I'm going to share an example. This is from one of the Click to Science learning modules, and the focus on this learning module is on asking purposeful questions. But what I want you to focus on is really not the verbal communication in the video, but look for the nonverbal messages that the staff member, Katie here, sends to the youth in her program. And be ready to share those in the chat box.
As a group at the end to see whose filter does what. Which group would like to start sharing their material?
So we were thinking we would have our dirty materials on top of this. We would put the water through and it would come out and it would leave the dirty materials behind.
What do you think the different functions might be?
They all catch gravel or dirt.
Okay, so gravel and dirt is being caught. Do you think they'll catch the same size dirt?
So then all different things get materials.
Okay. Do you think the different size of the materials might affect it? Okay. Can you talk me through what you were thinking here?
We should put a little slit right there. And then we can put the straw. And the straw will just go through there.
Oh, so
but
you're
then
saying the straw will
dirty
come out the
water
top?
might go. Because this is supposed to filter out some dirty water, and this has to filter out the rest.
Next, what do you see?
It's a little bit yellow, and like 1 or 2 pieces of charcoal got in it. So maybe we'll skip the charcoal next time.
So what do you think you can maybe try to get rid of some of that yellow color?
Maybe a little bit more of the cotton or a little bit of cheesecloth.
So maybe that's part of your redesign is where you want to put that, and you can add the other pieces. Everyone's going to get a chance to redesign these.
Nonverbal messages that you saw conveyed here in the webinar or in the video. One of the very powerful teaching skills that Katie seems to have and demonstrate in this video, which is focused on asking purposeful questions, is her skill in being an active listener. She really is conveying with her whole body that she cares about the answers she's getting from youth. She's actually doing the opposite of what that science teacher in our example earlier was doing. She's giving them her full presence and attention as they're talking to her. And by conveying that interest and attention, she's sending some strong positive messages that what they have to say matters and that they have good ideas, they're valued in this program. The important thing to remember here is micro-affirmations are really not about being nice in our after-school program. They are about supporting youth development. Micro-affirmations are intentional acts that help youth and staff members develop to their full potential. They're about more than words. Micro-affirmations are especially powerful in their nonverbal context. They are especially powerful when the messages come from a person who has more social capital than the recipient that is receiving the message. And micro-affirmations can really be transformational in your program. And that's what brings us back to the 4 steps that we introduced earlier, that this can make a difference in the level of engagement in your program. It can make a difference in behavior management challenges, and it can make a difference in outcomes for youth. So remember, the 4 steps are: first, assume that you have biases. Then examine your worldview. 3, be intentional about how you interact with others. And our 2 videos, I hope, gave you some examples of what that can look like. And then the 4th step that we're going to talk about now is make changes happen by focusing on one behavior at a time. So I hope that we're ready to be intentional about how we interact with the staff and youth in our program so that we can make changes. The 4th step in this process to make change happen is focus on one behavior at a time. Our intention here is to select one behavior to intentionally change in how we interact with others in our programs. Remember, in the video, there's a lot of focus on what the educators say, and we can be intentional about our verbal messages. But we have to remember that micro-messages are primarily nonverbal. So what you do is even more important than what you say. Micro-inequities emerge when a negative nonverbal message overwrites an insincere positive verbal message. So as you think about what intentional changes you want to make, you're going to have to decide in your program, is there more need now to decrease the micro-inequities or to increase the micro-affirmations? I'm going to share with you some intentional changes that you can make and encourage you to share in the chat box whether one of these sounds like a change you would like to see made in your program, or if you have other intentional changes you'd like to make. And one of the downloads in the resources pod is a handout called What We Do and Say Matters. And that is from one of the Click to Science training resources, where you can download the full resource, or you can download just the handout that has some specific strategies that staff can use. So here are some intentional changes that you could make, and share in the chat box which of these you'd like to see made in your program. You can practice acts of acknowledgement as you greet individuals as they enter the program and really acknowledge their presence. You can consider who you are leaving out and reach out to youth in the margins of your program. This is a way to decrease micro-inequities. You can increase micro-affirmations and decrease micro-inequities by getting to know the personal stories and goals of the youth and the staff in your program. As you know people personally, it's going to affect the micro messages that you send them, and you can reinforce their value and their potential. You can increase micro-affirmations by using individual names and providing sincere and warm acknowledgement of their presence in your program. You can also increase micro-affirmations by being completely present when you're talking with youth or staff. Get rid of distractions. Give them your complete attention. Listen to understand what people are saying without focusing on what you're going to say next, and let your sincerity right now is, what are the intentional changes that you would like to make yourself or see staff in your program make? This is the final step in our 4 steps of sending positive micro messages. So what would you like to see changed? I see some great ideas in the chat box about how you can make intentional changes that are going to really show the value of all the persons in your program. I have one more graphic I want to share with you. This is from the University of Chicago Consortium on Research. And it's just an illustration of the development of agency and competency and identity throughout different stages as children grow. And the goal here is to really help youth develop into young adults who are successful in all areas of their life. And what they're illustrating here is that these aspects of agency, identity, and competency develop in different phases of life, and there's different values at different points. But all through this cycle of development from early childhood to young adulthood, we can use micro-affirmations to support youth in developing to their full potential. We are helping youth learn how to establish healthy and respectful relationships, to find a meaningful place in their community, and to contribute to a larger good. So all of these things are goals of our after-school program. And we can, at different ages, depending on the age of youth in our program, focus on different aspects of their own agency and competency. One of the goals for this webinar is for you to leave with real strategies that you can use in your program to deliver micro-affirmations that will help youth reach these developmental goals. If you don't have ideas already about what changes you'd like to make, please do use the chat box to let us know what you're struggling with and what questions you have. And there are resources that you can download. The first one in the resources to download pod is Confronting My Own Biases. And then there's a training resource that you can use with your staff called What We Do and Say Matters. And in the web links, there are links to the videos that we used in the webinar today, and also to the National Alliance for Partnership and Equity, which is where the culture wheel illustration that we shared earlier came from. And there's also a link to Harvard's Project Implicit. And that is a great resource. I suggest you check out that link. It will help. There's a survey there that you can do that contributes to their larger data set, but also can help you and your staff understand what your implicit biases and assumptions are. Which leads us to this bottom line that I want you to take away from the webinar today. Micro messages are powerful. They are tools that can affirm and support youth, or can exclude and discourage them. We want you to be intentional about the messages that you're sending to your staff and to the youth in your program. I challenge you to be more conscious of your micro messages and not to hesitate to point out both the micro-affirmations and the micro-inequities that you see others in your program using. As we come to the end of our hour today, I want to encourage you to connect with Click to Science, to check out our revamped website that we hope is easier to use and pretty attractive, I think, also. I like the new design. Thank you for participating today and encourage you to complete the survey that comes up at the end of the webinar and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the next